There is a loneliness to the American desert that settles deep in the bones. It's a place of vast, beautiful emptiness. A place where the roads stretch out into horizons that look like the edge of the world. But it's also a place that holds secrets. A place where the past isn't always past. And where a simple wrong turn can unravel everything you thought you knew. This is the story of the Miller family, and the shortcut that led them not to their destination, but to a nightmare buried in the dust of Arizona. The air conditioner in the Miller family's minivan was fighting a losing battle. Outside, the Arizona sun hammered the landscape, bleaching the world into shades of pale tan and scorched red. Inside, the mood was just as brittle. David Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was a practical man, an engineer from Austin, and he despised two things: inefficiency and traffic. Right now, he was drowning in both. "I don't believe this," he muttered, staring at the endless line of red brake lights shimmering in the heat haze. They were on Interstate 40, the great artery of the American West, and it was choked. A jackknifed semi 2 miles ahead. The radio had said. 2 hours, minimum. Beside him, Sarah sighed, lowering her smartphone. No signal again. "I was trying to see if there's a detour." She glanced at her husband, seeing the muscle jump in his jaw. "David, honey, it's okay. We'll get there. We were supposed to be in Flagstaff by 6, Sarah. 6. At this rate, we won't even make it by midnight." In the back, the kids were wilting. Emily, 16, had given up on her phone and was staring blankly out the window, one earbud dangling. "This is literally the worst day of my life," she announced. "No, it's not," snapped David. "It is," she insisted. "It's hot. It smells like old fries. And I haven't had a signal in 3 states. Only 10-year-old Josh was quiet, his face pressed against the side window, watching the massive, sculpted rock formations slide by like sleeping giants. "I think it's cool," he said softly. "It looks like Mars." David grunted, his eyes darting from the unmoving traffic to the rearview mirror, then back to the road. This move to California was supposed to be a fresh start. A new job, a new life. All he could see now was a failed schedule. He reached over and snapped open the glove compartment. Sarah watched him, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "David, what are you doing?" He pulled it out. A thick, folded paper map, its creases softened by years of disuse. It was his father's map from the days before GPS. "There," he said, spreading it awkwardly over the steering wheel. He traced a thin, faded red line with his fingernail. "Look, Old Highway 7. It runs parallel to the interstate. It's an old road, probably. But it cuts north here and meets back up with the 40 just west of the blockage." Sarah leaned in. The line looked thin, uncertain. "David, it's probably not even paved. Or it could be closed. The map looks ancient." "It's fine," he said, his voice clipped with that false certainty she knew so well. "It's a designated highway. It'll be fine. It'll save us hours." He didn't wait for her to argue. He saw his chance. An exit ramp, just ahead, marked Ash Fork/Scenic Route. Without another word, he wrenched the wheel, bumping the minivan over the shoulder and onto the exit. "Dad, what are you doing?" Emily yelped as her phone slid off her lap. "Taking a shortcut," David said, his voice already more relaxed as the minivan picked up speed, leaving the gridlock behind. The road was empty. For the first 20 minutes, it was perfect. The minivan hummed along a 2-lane blacktop that wound gracefully through stands of juniper and pinyon pine. The sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of orange and violet. "See," David said, tapping the wheel. "What did I tell you? No traffic. Just us and the open road. This is the real America. Sarah relaxed just a little. It was beautiful. The air felt cleaner. Josh rolled down his window, letting the high desert wind whip through the car. Then the pavement ended. It didn't taper off. It just stopped, as if the road crew had gone to lunch one day in 1960 and never come back. What lay ahead was gravel, packed red dirt, and deep, rutted tracks. "David," Sarah said, her voice quiet. "It's fine," he said, though his grip tightened again. "It's just a rough patch. It'll pick back up." But it didn't. The road grew narrower. The brush on either side grew thicker, the branches of skeletal trees scraping against the minivan's windows with a sound like fingernails on glass. The GPS on the dash, which had been struggling, finally flickered and died. The screen went black. Emily held up her phone. Nothing. Not even no service. Just nothing. The sun, which had been their beautiful companion, was now their enemy. It dipped below the western mesas, and the shadows in the desert didn't just appear. They pooled. They filled the low spaces like dark water, rising fast. David slowed the van, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel. He was squinting into the growing twilight. The road was barely a suggestion now. I think we should turn back," Sarah whispered. "We can't," David said, his pride warring with a new, cold flicker of fear. "We've come at least 30 miles. We don't have enough gas to go back to the 40 and then sit in that traffic." He pulled the map out again, clicking on the dim dome light to see it. "The map says, Highway 7 continues for another 10 miles and then it stops." "It stops? No, it looks like it runs right into a town," he said, puzzled. "Ethelberg. It's right here. It must connect back to the main road there." A town. Sarah felt a brief surge of relief, followed by a deeper dread. Why had they never heard of a town out here? There were no signs, no lights. There was nothing. The minivan lurched, rolling over a deep pothole. The headlights cut a weak yellow beam into the absolute darkness. The desert was silent. No crickets, no coyotes. Just the sound of their own engine, which suddenly sounded terribly loud and terribly small. David's search for a faster path had led them somewhere slow, somewhere forgotten, and as the last sliver of sun disappeared, painting the high desert in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo, young Josh Miller, peering out the back window, was the first to ask the question they were all thinking. "Dad, where are we?" There are many kinds of fear. There is the sudden shock, the jump in the dark. But the worst kind is the slow kind, the creeping, cold realization that you are no longer in control. The moment you realize that the thin, metal shell protecting you from the world is about to fail. The minivan didn't just stall. It died. The chug-sputter-clunk was followed by a silence so complete it felt like a heavy blanket had been thrown over the car. The headlights, which had been their only comfort, flickered and went dark, plunging the family into the near-total blackness of the high desert. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed. There was only the sound of Sarah's sharp inhale and the tick-tick-tick of the hot engine contracting in the cold. "No, no, no," David whispered, twisting the key in the ignition. Click, 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 click. The starter made a dead, metallic sound. The battery was fine. The tank was empty. "You ran us out of gas." Emily's voice was sharp, cutting through the dark with the first edge of real panic. "You actually ran us out of gas in the middle of nowhere." "Emily, not now," Sarah snapped, her own voice trembling. She fumbled for the flashlight in the side pocket of the door. "But he did. I thought we'd make it to the town," David said, his voice hollow. His certainty was gone, evaporated into the cold night air. He slumped against the steering wheel, a man defeated. "What town, Dad?" Josh asked, his small voice piping up from the back. "I don't see any lights." That was the worst part. There were no lights. Nothing. No glow on the horizon. No distant farmhouse. No headlights from another, wiser driver. They were miles from the interstate, on a road that didn't exist on any modern map, with no gas, no signal, and no one. We just need to stay calm," Sarah said, trying to convince herself. She found the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam was bright, almost violent, illuminating the terrified faces of her family. "I'm getting out," David said. He pushed the door open, and the dome light, which had failed to come on earlier, suddenly flickered to life, bathing the interior in a sickly, pale light. He stepped out onto the gravel. The air was cold, much colder than it had been, and carried the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush and dust. He shined his phone's weak light down the road, but it was swallowed by the darkness. He walked a few paces forward, past the front of the dead minivan. He had stopped on the crest of a low hill. The road ahead dipped sharply, descending into a shallow, cup-like valley, and at the bottom of that valley was the town. "Sarah," he called out, his voice hushed. "Sarah, bring the big flashlight." The family piled out, huddling together against the sudden chill. Sarah clicked on the heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam where he was pointing. It wasn't a town. It was a photograph. A museum exhibit left to rot. Below them, perhaps a quarter-mile down the slope, lay a single main street. Buildings, dark and silent, stood shoulder to shoulder. General store in faded white letters, a barber shop with a striped pole, a saloon, and at the far end, the sharp, dark spike of a church steeple. It was perfect, too perfect. There were no broken windows. No graffiti, no collapsed roofs. It looked as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to come back for 50 years. But there were no lights, no cars parked on the street, no sign of life. "It's Ethelberg," David whispered, a strange mix of relief and awe in his voice. "It's real. We're saved. There has to be gas down there. Or at least a phone." Sarah kept the beam steady, scanning the storefronts. "David, I don't like this. Where is everyone? Why is it so dark?" "It's a small town, Sarah. An old town. They probably roll up the sidewalks at sunset. Maybe the power's out," he said, the excuses sounding thin even to his own ears. Emily shivered, pulling her thin hoodie tighter. "It's creepy. It's like one of those nuclear test towns." "It's fine," David said, forcing himself to move. "We don't have a choice. We can't stay up here. We have to go down and find help. We'll find a gas can, or maybe a landline." He grabbed the car keys as if by habit. "Okay, everybody stick together. Josh, you hold my hand. Emily, you stay right behind your mother." He started walking, and the family followed, their footsteps crunching too loudly on the gravel road. The beam of the flashlight bounced ahead of them, a single, searching eye in the immense darkness. The closer they got, the more unsettling the silence became. It was more than just quiet. It was a void of sound. No wind in the eaves. No insects. No distant highway noise. It was, as Sarah thought, like the whole town was vacuum-sealed, preserved in a jar of silence. They reached the end of the gravel road, where it met the town's main street. The pavement here was cracked, but swept clean. Not by a broom, but by wind. "Hello," David called out. His voice sounded flat, instantly absorbed by the dry wooden buildings. "Is anybody here? We need help." The only answer was the faintest squeak. 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 Sarah grabbed David's arm, her fingers digging in. What is that? David pointed the flashlight beam. Across the street, on the wide wooden porch of the Ethelberg Hotel, sat a single white-painted rocking chair. It was moving. It rocked back and forth rhythmically, steadily. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The beam held steady. There was no one in the chair. There was no wind. The branches on the dead trees lining the street were perfectly, unnaturally still. But the chair rocked on, as if pushed by an invisible, patient hand. It's just the wind," David said, but his voice was a strained whisper. "There is no wind, Dad," Emily said, her voice shaking. The chair rocked. Squeak, squeak, squeak. They stood frozen in the middle of the street, a small, terrified huddle of light in a town that had been waiting for them. They had come looking for salvation, for gas in a can or a friendly voice on a phone. But the town of Ethelberg had a different kind of welcome. And the silence, they were beginning to realize, was not because the town was empty. It was because the town was listening. A place of sanctuary, they had hoped. But as the empty chair rocked on, they learned the lesson of the high desert. A port in a storm isn't always safe. Sometimes, it's the heart of the storm itself. What else was moving in the dark, just beyond the beam of their flashlight? And what choice did they have but to keep walking? How long can you stare at the impossible before you are forced to accept it? The Miller family stood in the silent street of Ethelberg, caught between two fears: the vast, empty desert behind them, and the single, ghostly motion ahead. The rocking chair was a message. It said, "We see you." It said, "This is not your home." But desperation is a stronger force than fear. Cold was seeping into their bones, and the darkness was absolute. They had to find help. It's just an old house," David said, his voice a dry rasp. He tore his eyes from the rocking chair. "It's settling. Or a draft. It doesn't matter." He forced his gaze to the building next to it. "The general store. That's our best bet. A store will have a phone. It has to." He didn't wait for an answer. He needed to move to do something practical. He walked, and his family followed, a tight, frightened cluster. The front of the store was a wall of dark glass, reflecting their own pale faces in the flashlight beam. A sign hung crookedly from one chain, its painted letters spelling Ethelberg Emporium, Sundries, Gas, Ice. David put his hand on the wooden door handle. It was cold. He pushed. The door swung open with a long, low crii that echoed down the empty street. It wasn't locked. It had never been locked. A smell rolled out to meet them, the smell of a place that had been sealed for generations. It was the scent of dry rot, of mice long since turned to dust, of forgotten spices, and of something else, something metallic and cold like old pennies. David stepped inside, shining the light around. "Hello?" he called. "Is anyone working?" The beam cut through an air thick with floating dust motes. They were in a time capsule. The store was full. The shelves were perfectly stocked. Not a single can was out of place. But it was a store from 1_9_50 something. Tin cans of Ovaltine and coffee sat next to boxes of soap powder, their labels bright and unfaded. A glass counter displayed rows of petrified candy. Sugar daddies, Mary Janes, and wax lips, all arranged in neat, orderly rows. And everything, every can, every box, every inch of the wooden floor, was covered in a uniform, fine, gray dust. It was as if a single, soft, ashen snow had fallen and never melted. "David," Sarah whispered, running her finger along the counter. It came away coated in the silvery gray powder. It's all here, but it's wrong." Emily coughed. waving a hand in front of her face. Ugh, it's in the air. I can't breathe. David was in mission mode. A phone, he muttered, sweeping the flashlight beam behind the counter. He saw it. A heavy, black-bodied rotary phone. He lunged for it, grabbing the receiver and lifting it to his ear. He held it for a long, silent moment. His face fell. "What?" Sarah asked. "Nothing," he said, placing it back in its cradle. Not even a dial tone. Just dead. The line must have been cut decades ago. The hope that had carried them down the hill began to curdle into true, cold dread. They were in a ghost town. A real ghost town. Dad. It was Josh. He had let go of David's hand and wandered a few feet away, drawn by something. "Josh, stay close," Sarah ordered. "But Dad, look." He was standing by an open wooden barrel at the front of the store, just inside the door. David shined the light on it. It was full of apples. Unlike everything else, they were not covered in dust. They were bright, shiny, and ruby red. They looked perfectly, impossibly fresh, as if they'd been polished and set out that very morning. "Don't touch them, Josh," Sarah warned, her voice sharp. "But they look okay," he said. He was a 10-year-old boy. He was hungry, and they were the only thing in this whole dead place that looked alive. Before anyone could stop him, he reached in and picked one up. He held it in his small palm. "See? It's fine." And then it happened. The apple's skin, which had been so taut and red, seemed to lose its cohesion. Puckered, then grayed. In the space of a single second, the entire fruit collapsed in on itself. It didn't rot. It disintegrated. With a soft poof, the apple dissolved into a cloud of the same fine, gray ash that covered the store. It poured through Josh's fingers, piling up on his sneakers, the sudden, distinct scent of bitter almonds and dust filling the air. Josh screamed and scrambled back, wiping his hand frantically on his jeans. "My God!" David whispered, staring at the gray powder. Plink, 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 plink. "What is that?" Emily hissed, her eyes wide, darting into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" "Shoo!" Sarah commanded. They all stood perfectly still, their hearts hammering. The sound was tiny, faint. It was the sound of tinny, delicate music. A music box. It was not coming from the storefront. It was coming from upstairs, from the dark, unseen second floor of the building. A slow, childlike, 5-note melody, playing over and in, again and again. Plink, 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 plink. The store was not just a store. It was someone's home, and they were in it. "David," Sarah said, her voice barely a breath. "The gas can." David saw it, near the back door, as if waiting for them. A classic, 5-gallon red metal gas can. He grabbed it, his hand shaking. It was light, empty. Of course it was empty. They had disturbed this place. They had touched the untouchable, and now the house was waking up. The things on the shelves, the perfect, preserved goods, the shiny, treacherous apples. They weren't for sale. They were a display, a trap, a silent warning to all who might enter. Do not touch. Do not take. Do not disturb what has been left to time. The music box played on. Plink, 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 plink. It was getting ever so slightly louder. "We're leaving," David said, his voice cracking. "Now." He grabbed Josh by the hand and all but threw the family back out the open door, into the cold, silent street. As he pulled the door shut, the rocking chair on the porch across the street, which had stopped, gave a single loud squeak. They were back in the dark. But they were no longer alone. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It clears the mind of everything but one thought. Escape. The Millers had burst out of the general store, driven by the impossible apple and the ghostly music from the floor above. They were back in the street, but the street was no longer just empty. It was waiting. They stood in a tight, four-person huddle, gasping in the cold, dry air. The beam from Sarah's flashlight was frantic, zigzagging across the silent building facades. "Okay. Okay." David panted, his voice high and strained. He was still gripping the useless, empty gas can, a red metal burden. "We go back. We walk back to the van. We'll wait until morning. Someone will come. Someone must use this road." "What was that, Dad?" Josh was crying, his face buried in his father's jacket. "What happened to the apple?" "It doesn't matter, son. It was just old. It was all just rotten." David was lying, and they all knew it. "David, the chair." Sarah's voice was a dead-level whisper. They all looked. The rocking chair on the hotel porch had stopped. It was perfectly still, angled slightly toward the street, as if its occupant had just stood up to get a better look at them. "It's not moving," David said, stating the obvious, desperate for any sign of normalcy. "No," Emily said, her head tilted. She was staring not at the chair, but at the dark, glassless window just above it, on the hotel's second floor. "But there's someone in the window." The blood in David's veins turned to ice. "What did you say?" "There's someone in the window," Emily repeated, her voice shaking but firm. She pointed. "Right there. They're watching us." David snapped the flashlight beam up. First he saw nothing. Just the black, rectangular void of the empty window frame. A deeper darkness within the building. "There's nothing there, Em. You're just spooked." "No. Keep the light on it," she insisted. "Don't move it." David held the beam steady. His heart hammered against his ribs. He squinted, and then he saw it. It wasn't a person. It was the shape of a person. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette, standing just back from the window, deep in the room's shadows. It was darker than the darkness. It had no features, no clothes, just a head, a torso, and long, still arms. And it was turned directly toward them. "My God!" Sarah breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. It's just a mannequin," David stammered. "Right? From the hotel lobby." But as his eyes adjusted, he realized Emily was right. They were being watched. And not just from the hotel. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck. A sense of being surrounded. Slowly, deliberately, he moved the flashlight beam to the next building, the saloon. There was another one, standing in the dark, recessed doorway. He swept the light across the street to the barber shop, a smaller shape visible in the glass, on the roof of the Ethelberg Bank, in the black, cavernous opening of the livery and stable, in the narrow alleyway between two buildings. They were everywhere, a town of silent, motionless figures, all standing in the shadows, all facing the family in the street. They were not people. They were, as David realized with a sickening lurch, made of the same substance as the apple. They looked like silhouettes cut from the night, coated in that same fine, gray, shimmering ash. They were the watchers, the toll takers. Who are you?" David shouted, his voice cracking, a pathetic, desperate challenge. "We don't want any trouble. We're just lost." His voice echoed once, sharply, "Lost," and then was smothered by the silence. The figures did not move. They did not answer. They did not seem to breathe. They just stood, their faceless heads aimed at the small pocket of light in their street. This was their town. This was their home. And the Millers were trespassing. David, the flashlight, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the original figure in the hotel window. Shine it on him again. David aimed the beam back at the hotel window. The figure was still there, unmoving. It did not flinch from the bright light. It did not raise a hand to shield its eyes. But something else happened. Something impossible. The light cast the figure's shadow on the faded wallpaper of the room behind it. As the Millers watched, paralyzed, the shadow, and only the shadow, began to move. It seemed to detach itself from the figure. It grew, stretching not up the wall but down. It spilled across the floor of the room, like black ink, moving toward the open window. It lengthened, distorted, and then, impossibly, it began to stretch out of the window, reaching, lengthening across the porch roof, and flowing down the wall toward the street. It was stretching towards the family. A cold, unearthly wind, the first they had felt, swept down the street, carrying the scent of dust and bitter almonds. That broke the spell. Josh screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered the night. "Run!" David yelled. He dropped the gas can. It hit the pavement with a hollow clang. He grabbed Josh's hand. Sarah grabbed Emily. And the four of them as one turned and ran. They ran back the way they came, back up the hill toward the dark, dead shape of their minivan. Their footsteps echoed, a frantic, pounding rhythm in a town that had not heard such a sound in an age. They had learned the hard way the lesson of these forgotten places. You are never, ever alone. The past does not die. It just settles, like dust, and waits for someone to disturb it. They scrambled up the gravel road, slipping and sliding in their sneakers, the sounds of their own panic filling their ears. But as they ran, they had no idea if the figures were following. They only knew that their shadows were. Instinct. When faced with the unnatural, the brain discards logic and returns to the most basic command. Flee. The Millers ran, propelled by the silent, chilling gaze of the watchers and the sight of those impossible, stretching shadows. The only goal was the minivan, the dead shell of metal that represented their last link to the world they understood. They ran hard, scrambling up the loose gravel slope they had just descended. The cold air burned in their lungs. David looked back once, briefly, holding the flashlight steady. But the light only showed the empty road and the black maw of the valley. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being chased, was suffocating. Is the car there? Sarah gasped, her voice raw. It has to be. David panted. We can't be far. Just keep going. They crested the low hill where the minivan lay. But as David's light swept the area, there was only brush, sage, and the dark, empty horizon. It's gone, Emily screamed, stumbling to a halt. Where is the car? David stopped, spinning in a circle, desperately casting the beam into the darkness. His minivan, their Texas lifeline, was nowhere to be seen. The road, as far as the light could penetrate, was completely empty. They had run up the road, but the car was not there. No. No, 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 David whispered, the reality of their impossible situation crushing him. He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide and panicked. I parked it right here. I know I did. I was right on the crest. Dad, look down. Josh whimpered, pointing with a shaking finger. David followed Josh's direction, shining the light not at the road ahead, but down the hill behind them. And there it was, the same single unpaved road, the same gentle slope leading down, the same silhouettes of the buildings in the distance, nestled in the valley. They had run back down the hill. That's impossible, David stammered. We were running uphill. We were running away. Sarah felt a wave of dizzying disorientation. The town wasn't just silent and watched. It was impossible. The geography had folded in on itself. They had run for 5 solid minutes, their legs aching, their lungs burning, only to find themselves right back where they started. They were trapped. "We ran in a circle," Emily muttered, tears streaming down her face. "But there's no circle. It's a straight road." David didn't try to explain it. He knew. They hadn't run in a physical circle. The road itself had looped. The town had absorbed them, using their panic against them. "We have to go another way," he said, forcing a semblance of control. "We'll go into the town, but we'll take a side street. Find the path that leads out of the valley." He changed direction instantly, leading them off the main street. They darted behind the barber shop, plunging into the narrow, lightless alleyway. The air here was heavy and stagnant, smelling of old coal smoke and decay. "Hurry! Don't stop looking up," Sarah urged, remembering the watchers on the roofs. The alley opened onto a dusty side street, lined with small, identical wooden houses, each with a neat, dead flower bed and a dark, blank window. David led them around the corner, running past a weathered sign pointing down a new road, County Road 11, to Route 66. "Yes," David yelled, spotting the hopeful sign. "That's it. Route 66. That's salvation." They sprinted down the road, their hopes lifting with every stride. The street was rougher, less swept. It was clearly the way out. They ran past a derelict schoolhouse, its playground equipment standing like metal skeletons against the night sky. They ran for a full minute, until their side was splitting and their breath was ragged gasps. The road curved sharply to the left, around a thicket of dry brush and dead pinyon trees. "Almost there," Sarah encouraged. They rounded the corner, expecting to see the final, open road. Instead, they saw the front of the general store. The Ethelberg Emporium, its dark windows staring back at them. And across the street, on the wooden porch of the hotel, the single white rocking chair. Squeak! It gave one single, slow, deliberate rock. They stood frozen, their mouths open, staring at the impossible impossibility. They had run down a side road that led to the beginning of the town. The loop was absolute. The town did not want them to leave. "We're going to die here," Emily sobbed, falling to her knees in the dust. David felt the last of his strength drain away. His legs were shaking. He gripped the edge of the store's porch, looking around wildly. And then he noticed the figures. They were closer now. They weren't in the windows or on the roofs. They were on the street. Lining the pavement, every 20 feet or so, stood the silent, gray, ashen silhouettes. They stood with their backs to the buildings, perfectly still, their faceless heads all turned, slowly, uniformly, toward the 4 millers huddled in the street. They were forming a silent, gray picket fence. The town had closed its arms around them. The watchers were waiting for them to make another choice. They could run again, but David knew the truth. There was no running from this problem. The town had captured them by simply being itself. He pulled Josh to his chest, closing his eyes for a brief, defeated moment. He thought of his impatience, his quick decision to turn off the safe, slow interstate. He had cut the corner. And now the corner was cutting back. The lesson was stark and immediate. When a problem traps you, running only makes the cage smaller. You cannot run from a truth that is woven into the ground beneath your feet. You must stop, breathe, and finally, look for a way through the center of the terror, not around it. "We're not running anymore," David said, his voice surprisingly steady, but laced with a finality that terrified Sarah. "We're going to find out what this place wants." He looked past the watchers, down the long, silent main street, toward the only building that hadn't been fully explored, the one at the very end. The dark, high spike of the old church steeple. The greatest courage is not found in action, but in the cessation of action. The Millers stopped running. They began to walk. It was an act of surrender, yes, but also a final, terrifying choice to confront the impossible. To walk past the figures that had stalked them from the shadows, now standing openly, daring them forward. Every step was a monumental effort. David held Josh tightly, his eyes fixed only on the church ahead. Sarah followed, guiding Emily, who was numb with silent shock. As they walked past the watchers, they could see them more clearly in the flashlight beam. They weren't statues. They weren't wood or stone. They were like compacted air, made of that swirling gray ash, yet perfectly defined with the posture of people standing at attention. They were bone-dry and silent, radiating an unbearable coldness that made the hairs on David's arms stand up. "Don't look at them," David mumbled, his lips barely moving. "Just look at the church." But Josh, driven by childhood curiosity and fear, lifted his head slightly. As they passed one of the figures standing outside the barber shop, Josh saw something. The watcher's hands, hanging limply at its sides, were slightly cupped, and in the palm of the ashen hand lay a single dry, brittle coin, an old American silver dollar. Plink. He heard the music box again, tiny and tinny, coming from the watcher itself, a sound resonating from within the silent figure. Plink. Plink, plink, plink. They finally reached the church at the end of the street. It was a simple, wooden structure, painted white 100 years ago, now peeling and gray. A small, arched, stained-glass window sat above the main double doors. "In here," David said, his voice husky. "Sanctuary." The doors were heavy, but like the general store, they were not locked. David shouldered them open, and they rushed inside, slamming the doors shut behind them. The click of the heavy latch, though inadequate, felt like a powerful defense. The interior was surprisingly intact. High, arched ceilings, a simple altar, and rows of dusty wooden pews. Unlike the store, the air here felt cleaner, though still thick with the smell of aged wood and old incense. The moment the doors closed, the sound of the music box outside instantly stopped. The oppressive feeling of being watched lifted, replaced by a tense, nervous relief. "We're safe," Sarah whispered, slumping into a pew, pulling Emily down beside her. "We're safe in here." David went to the windows, peering out from behind the edges of the thick, dust-laden curtains. The watchers stood across the street, motionless, looking like a silent, waiting congregation. They hadn't moved. They hadn't chased them inside. He walked up the aisle to the simple altar. On it lay a heavy, leather-bound book. "What is that?" Sarah asked, walking toward him. "It looks like a Bible," David said, opening the cover carefully. But it wasn't a Bible. Inside, the pages were filled with elegant, sloping script, written in fading brown ink. It was a pastor's journal. The last entry was dated October 1947. October 2nd, 1947. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, reading aloud in a hushed voice. "The well is dry. We are punished. The canyon road is dust and despair. It is not enough that we sealed the road. They have sealed us in turn. God does not forgive greed, only waiting." David flipped backward through the pages, his eyes scanning the desperate entries. The Reverend Silas Vance chronicled the final days of Ethelberg. It had been a prosperous silver mining town, arrogant in its wealth and isolated from the rest of Arizona. In the summer of 1947, a crippling drought hit the region. A wagon train of settlers, moving west and desperate for water, came through the canyon pass. They begged the town for help, offering silver, gold, and their last possessions for a few barrels of water. The town council, led by the greedy mine owner, refused. They had their own small reserve, and they would not share it with strangers and vagrants. The journal described the settlers turning back, defeated, dying of thirst just 10 miles up the road. The final, heartbreaking line written by the Reverend before the settlers departed. "They left us with a curse, one we deserved. May your prosperity turn to ash, and may you wait forever for the toll you denied." The curse took hold immediately. The silver mine dried up. Their well turned to dust. The townspeople tried to leave, but the road that led out had disappeared, replaced by impossible loops and dead ends. Ethelberg was cut off, its people trapped in their prosperity, which instantly turned to rot and ash. "The Watchers," David whispered, his hand trembling as he traced the Reverend's script. "They're the townspeople. They were cursed to wait for the toll they should have taken." October 29th, 1947. The last legible entry was frantic. "Something is happening. The silence is profound. My family, my people, they are hardening. They are turning to the dust of their own greed. They are no longer living. They are waiting. And what they wait for, I do not know. But when the road is opened again, even by accident, I pray the travelers have compassion, or they will be asked to pay the debt of our town." David closed the journal slowly. The church was not a sanctuary. It was a testament, a shrine to the town's wicked, unforgivable greed. The music box started again, but this time it was coming from inside the church. Plink, 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 plink. It was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the building, near the vestry. They were trapped inside the very heart of the curse. They had disturbed a place of eternal punishment. The people of Ethelberg hadn't died. They had become the guardians of their own karmic prison, and the Millers were the first travelers to stumble upon their long, eternal wait. The lesson was terrifyingly clear. The moral decay of the past does not simply fade away. It solidifies, becoming a tangible, horrifying reality that demands restitution from the present. David looked at his family, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. The townspeople were waiting for a payment. They were the toll takers, and the Millers had nothing to pay with. Fear changes a man. It strips away the pretense, the pride, the engineering degrees, and leaves only the naked truth of who he is. For David Miller, that truth was laid bare in the dusty silence of the church. They were trapped by a century-old curse, a karma that demanded a toll. But what payment could the living offer to the ashen, waiting dead? The music box was definitely inside the church. It was close, but seemingly invisible, its sound echoing and rebounding off the high wooden ceiling. It was as if the sound itself was the entity, seeking them out. Sarah, her face pale, scanned the back of the church where the sound seemed strongest, near the vestry door. "David, we have to hide. They know we're here. They can hear us." "Hiding won't work," David said, his voice flat. He was still holding the Reverend's journal, its ancient leather cold beneath his fingers. He looked at the altar, then at the stained glass window above the door, its simple geometric panes covered in a thick layer of dust. "This is not about being quiet," he continued, turning to face his family. "This is about the toll. We came onto their road without respect. We trespassed. We are the travelers they refused to help, but now we are the ones being asked to pay the debt." He looked at his kids. Emily sat rigid, staring at the floor, fighting tears. Josh, however, was shivering, not just from the cold, but from guilt. "Dad?" Josh whispered, clutching the fabric of his jeans. The apple wasn't the only thing." David knelt immediately, putting the journal aside. "What are you talking about, son?" Josh's eyes welled up. He reached into the deep pocket of his cargo shorts and pulled something out. It was small, tarnished, and antique. "I found it under the counter in the general store," he confessed, holding it out in his trembling hand. I put it in my pocket before we left. It looked cool. It was a tiny, die-cast toy car. A miniature, perfectly detailed Model T Ford, coated in a dull, coppery gray. The wheels were frozen solid. A child's treasure, stolen from a dead town. "Oh, Josh," Sarah sighed, sinking down beside him. "Why?" "I don't know," he cried, tears now streaming down his dusty cheeks. "It was the only thing that looked fun. I didn't mean to steal it." David took the toy car. It was incredibly cold, radiating the same chill he'd felt when passing the Watchers. He knew instantly. This was a piece of the payment the town was owed. A piece of the life they had frozen in time. They had taken something, just as the original townspeople had refused to give something. But one small, dusty toy car couldn't be the full toll for the sins of a whole family. "This is part of it," David said, showing the car to Sarah. "It's a debt of dishonesty, Josh. We came here lost and we took something. You must never take what doesn't belong to you, no matter how small." He looked at the tiny, worthless car in his hand, then out at the dark street where the Watchers waited. He remembered the journal. Greed and impatience. David's mind raced. He had taken them off the interstate because of impatience. He had disregarded the safe path for his own selfish desire to save 2 hours. That was his debt. That was his toll. He stood up, walking back toward the altar. "They aren't just looking for objects, Sarah. They're looking for an acknowledgement. They're looking for the compassion they were denied." The music box stopped. The church was silent again. The silence was heavier than before, expectant. Then, a low, collective thump came from the front doors, followed by another, the sound of something large and heavy pressing against the wood. The Watchers were testing their sanctuary. "David, what are you going to do?" Sarah pleaded, clutching Josh and Emily. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was still black. He tossed it onto the altar. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he grabbed the expensive, sophisticated GPS unit that had failed him and ripped it from the dash. He threw that, too, onto the altar, next to the Reverend's journal. "My impatience," he said, staring at the useless technology. "My belief that technology and speed could outsmart the old ways. That's what led us here." He placed the small, cold toy car next to the GPS, completing the offering. The toll for dishonesty and impatience. He then walked to the heavy wooden doors. Sarah watched in silent horror. "David, no. They'll take you." He ignored her. He stood before the door, took a deep breath and spoke, his voice shaking with fear, yet strangely strong with newfound humility. "We are here," he called out into the dead silence of the town. "We heard you. We read your story. We know your pain." He reached for the latch. "We respect this place," David continued, tears now blurring his vision. "We were wrong to trespass. We were impatient and selfish. And we are sorry for disturbing your wait." With a final, terrible resolve, David unlatched the doors. He pulled the heavy wood inward, revealing the vast, cold darkness of the street. The Watchers were gone from across the street. They were standing directly outside the church doors. A dense, silent crowd of gray, ashen figures, their silent heads tilted, looking down at David Miller. He was face to face with the toll takers. He was about to find out if courage, true humility and honesty, could pay a debt of greed. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is the moment you meet your greatest terror, and you do not run. David Miller stood on the threshold of the church, the cold emanating from the watchers so profound it felt like it was freezing his blood. He could feel Sarah, Emily, and Josh cowering behind him, their combined terror a physical weight on his back. The figures did not move. They did not reach. They did not make a sound. They simply stood, a silent, gray jury, their presence an unbearable question. They were the embodiment of a century of waiting, and he was the first traveler to ever acknowledge their sentence. His voice was a dry, cracking whisper. We understand, he said, his gaze fixed on the tallest figure, the one that seemed to be at the center of the crowd. We read the journal. We know what happened here. We know your town, your greed. He felt a tremor run through the figures, a subtle, collective shimmer of the ash, as if the word itself had struck them. We trespassed, David continued, his voice gaining a small measure of strength. We came here out of impatience. My impatience. I ignored the safe road because I was selfish. He stepped back, keeping his eyes on the watchers. He walked to the altar, his family parting to let him pass. His hand, shaking so badly he could barely control it, hovered over the offerings. My son. He took this, David said, his voice echoing in the church. He picked up the tiny, cold toy car. He was dishonest. He didn't understand. But we understand now. We return what was taken. He turned back to the watchers, holding the car out in his open palm. He walked slowly, agonizingly, back to the open doorway. He stepped out of the church onto the dusty ground, into the center of the crowd. The watchers turned, their movements fluid and silent, their collective gaze following him. He was surrounded. He held his hand out to the tall, central figure. We return this. We are sorry. The figure, which had the vague outline of a man in a long coat, did not move to take the car. It simply looked down at the offering. It's not enough, is it? David whispered, his courage failing. The figure slowly raised one gray, ashen arm. It was a terrible, slow motion, like watching a statue come to life. It did not point at David. It did not point at the car. It pointed past David, into the church, its long, thin finger aimed directly at the altar. David turned. The watcher was pointing at the GPS unit and the dead smartphone. A new, dawning horror settled on David. They didn't just want the toy. They wanted the offering. They wanted his pride. And he had to give it, not just leave it on the altar. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. Help me. Sarah, seeing his terror, found her own strength. She nodded, herding the children toward him. We do it together, she whispered. She picked up the GPS. David picked up his phone. Emily, in a burst of teenage bravery, grabbed the Reverend's journal. And Josh, sniffling, held the tiny toy car. As a family, they walked out of the church and stood before the silent, waiting jury. One by one, they presented their tolls. Josh, tears streaming, held out the car. I'm sorry I took it. Emily held out the journal. We're sorry we read your secrets. Sarah held out the GPS. We're sorry we didn't respect your road. And David held out his phone. I'm sorry for my impatience. I'm sorry for my pride. They held their offerings in their outstretched hands. They were a family admitting their flaws, admitting their disrespect, and asking for passage. They were not fighting. They were not running. They were, in the most profound way, surrendering to the moral law of the town. The lesson was complete. You cannot break a curse by fighting it. You cannot escape a karmic debt by running. You can only pay it in full with the one currency that holds any value in a place of such profound loss: humility. The tall watcher, the one they had offered to, looked at the items in their hands. It looked at their faces one by one. Then, for the first time, it moved its head, tilted it as if considering. and from deep within its ashen chest, the tinny, five-note melody of the music box began to play. Not loud or menacing, but softly, almost mournfully. In that moment, time itself seemed to be holding its breath. The millers stood, exposed and vulnerable, having given the only toll they possessed: their apology, their honesty, their humility. The air was electric with a century of unresolved tension. They had faced the ghosts of Ethelberg not with weapons, but with remorse. And now they waited for the verdict. The tall watcher slowly, so slowly, raised its other hand. David flinched, pulling Josh closer, but the figure made no aggressive move. It held its two ashen hands over the family's offerings: the car, the journal, the GPS, the phone, as if warming them at a fire. It did not take them. It didn't want the items. It had never wanted the objects. David realized, with a stunning, profound clarity, that the curse wasn't a demand for payment. It was a cry for acknowledgement. The watchers weren't guards, they were prisoners, and the offerings were not a bribe, but the key. The act of giving them up, the humility in that surrender, was the compassion the town had been denied. The music box melody, which had been a loop of 5 simple notes, suddenly changed, played a new, complex chord, a resolving chord, and then a new sound began. It was not a creak. It was not a footstep. It was the sound of the wind, a real, living, breathing wind, sweeping down from the mesas that surrounded the valley. It was the first natural sound they had heard since leaving the interstate. It started as a low whistle, then grew to a rushing, cleansing roar. The wind swept down the main street, kicking up clouds of real, brown dust. It hit the first of the watchers lining the street, and the figure faltered. The watcher seemed to shimmer, its solid, ashen form loosening, the particles of gray dust that held its shape beginning to vibrate. The wind passed through it, and the figure dissolved, scattering into a million motes of harmless powder, carried away instantly on the gust. The wind hit the next watcher and the next. All down the street, the silent, gray jury was being undone. They were not screaming. They were not fighting. They were simply letting go. The wind reached the church. It swirled around the family, cold but clean, smelling of sage and rain. It hit the crowd of watchers at the door. One by one they unraveled. The figures turned to smoke, to ash, to nothing, their long vigil finally over. The tall watcher in front of David was the last to go. It looked up from the offerings, its featureless face turning toward the open sky. It raised its arms, not in menace, but in relief. As the wind took it, the music box sound played one final, clear note, which then faded into the rush of the air. The oppressive, bone-deep cold vanished, replaced by the natural, crisp chill of the desert night. In the space of 30 seconds, they were gone. The millers stood alone, in the middle of a completely empty street, still holding their offerings. The town was no longer a trap. It was just a town, a sad, abandoned, broken-down ghost town. The moonlight, which had seemed menacing, now simply illuminated the peeling paint, the sagging porch roofs, and the cracked pavement. The silence was no longer a presence. It was just an absence. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. David looked at the GPS in his hand, then at his phone. They were just plastic and glass again. He put them back in his pocket. Josh quietly slipped the toy car back into his. The town had refused their payment, accepting only their apology. The lesson was final and absolute. True remorse, an honest admission of one's faults, holds a power that can undo the darkest of curses. Atonement isn't about giving something up. It's about the willingness to change. Listen, Emily said, her head tilted. There it was. Faint, distant, unmistakable. The sound of a semi-truck hitting its air brakes. The sound of the interstate. The van, David said, his voice raw with hope. He grabbed Sarah's hand. They didn't walk. They ran. Back up the street, past the empty, now truly harmless general store. They ran up the gravel hill, and this time the road didn't loop. It went straight. And there, at the crest of the hill, exactly where they had left it, sat their minivan, a dark, beautiful, normal shape against the starry sky. Freedom. It is a word we use so often, yet rarely understand. For the Millers, freedom was not a concept. It was the familiar, worn fabric of their car seats. It was the smell of old coffee and floor mats. It was the mundane, beautiful, normal world they had left behind, and now had miraculously found again. Get in, lock the doors, David yelled, sliding into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. It's not going to start, Emily whispered from the back, her voice hollow with dread. We're still here. It's not going to let us. It will, David said, more a prayer than a command. It has to. He turned the key. For one agonizing, silent second, there was nothing but the familiar click, click, click of a dead engine. The sound they'd heard an eternity ago. No, Sarah breathed, her eyes squeezing shut. Please, David begged, trying again. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal. A pointless, frustrated gesture. Click, click, click. Dad, Josh yelled, pointing at the dashboard. The gas. David looked. The fuel gauge, which had been buried on empty, was now quivering. The needle slowly, impossibly, rose from E and settled directly on F. Full. David didn't question it. He didn't pause. He turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life. A deafening, beautiful mechanical sound. The headlights blazed on, cutting two perfect, white cones into the darkness, illuminating the gravel road ahead. Go! Sarah screamed. David, go! He threw the minivan into drive, and the tires spun on the loose gravel, kicking up a plume of dust. The vehicle fishtailed, then gripped, lurching forward. David stomped on the accelerator, and the van shot up the last few feet of the hill, away from the dark valley of Ethelberg. He did not look in the rearview mirror. No one did. They stared forward, at the beam of their own headlights, their lifeline pulling them out of the darkness. The road was just a road. It didn't loop. It didn't twist. Climbed, and at the top of the rise they saw it. It was the most beautiful sight in the world. Less than a mile away, elevated on a built-up causeway, was a river of light. The bright, steady headlights and the red, receding taillights of Interstate 40. The sound of it, the deep whoosh of 18-wheelers, was the sound of safety, of civilization, of the 21st century. David drove, his foot hard on the gas, the van bumping and rattling over the last stretch of the forgotten highway. The road rose to meet the interstate, merging onto a simple, unmarked on-ramp. The minivan's tires hit the smooth asphalt of the I-40. The transition was immediate. The rattling stopped, replaced by the smooth hum of the road. The second the tires touched the pavement, the car clock on the dashboard, which had been frozen at 7:14 p.m., flickered. To flash 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and then settled on the current time, 10:14 p.m., 3 hours. They had been off the highway for exactly 3 hours. David merged the van into the slow lane, falling in line behind a massive, brightly lit produced truck. He was driving 65 miles an hour. Felt normal. Felt sane. For a long time, the only sound in the car was their own ragged breathing, slowly returning to normal. Finally, Sarah turned in her seat. She looked out the back window. "David," she said, her voice quiet, Where did we come from?" He glanced in the rearview mirror. He saw only the dark, empty Arizona desert stretching out behind them, flat and black under the moon. "What do you mean? The on-ramp?" "It's right." His voice trailed off. There was no on-ramp. There was no turnoff for Old Highway 7. There was no gravel road. There was just the solid, chain-link fence of the interstate, and beyond it, a sheer, rocky drop into a dark, empty canyon. It was as if the road they had been on had never existed. The family was silent. They had been given a full tank of gas, and the door to Ethelberg had been sealed behind them. They had paid their toll and the debt was closed. They drove on, just another set of headlights in the river of light, carrying a secret they would never, ever be able to explain. They had learned a lesson that night, one that no map could ever teach. The fastest way forward is not always a straight line. Sometimes the only way to move on is to stop, to face the past, and to pay the respects that are due. We are a nation of roads. We build them to conquer the wilderness, to save time, to connect our lives. But the land is old and it remembers. For every new, shining interstate, there are 1,000 forgotten paths like Old Highway 7, cut off by time but not by memory. The Millers made it to California. They never spoke of Ethelberg again. But David, they say, never used a shortcut for the rest of his life. He was a man who had learned, in the most terrifying way, that it is always better to be late than to arrive at a destination that isn't on any map at all. Thank you for joining us on Scary Folktales USA. Be careful on your next road trip. You never know what old debts are waiting to be paid just off the next exit.